So, before I get into this whole innovation disruption thing, let's start with some important things. One, I respect you. I do. I understand the challenges that you're all facing every day trying to make this industry work. And I honor that work. I don't think that, because you're on the finance side or the business side, that this is any less important than what's happening on the clinical side or the policy side. This is really, really, really important work. Figuring out how we're going to pay for this stuff is maybe the most important thing any of us are doing at this moment. So thank you for doing that work. And I have to be honest with you. I am a little worried about you right now. And the reason why I'm a little worried is because you all are not doing an awesome job telling your story. And your story really, really matters. The story always matters. You can't get people to care about what you want to do or go on really important journeys like the one you're on right now without a compelling story. So, allow me to try to start to jumpstart the first draft of your story. And guess what? It's a first draft. If you don't like it, you can throw it away and work on another one when we get out of here. But let's just start to work on a first draft together now, if that's okay. So you got to start with a headline, right? We're not going to start small. Breaking news. The United States healthcare industry must return to its innovative roots and significantly improve itself quickly, or the future of the country is in serious jeopardy. That's the headline. Some of you are like, okay. And then some of you are like, dude, here we go again with the country stuff. I get it. Lots of people are out here saying these really, really big statements, and they're throwing out hollow narratives to you. But let's just put that to the side for a second. I want to go back to Z-Dog yesterday, and even what Mike just did. I believe that the eye rolling comes from the pressures of the positions that you all hold, right? Because when you integrate everything, when you don't compartmentalize, when you integrate everything, and you don't just operate from your position of your title or your organizational responsibility, what I've learned about you, probably the biggest surprise for an outsider to learn about you, is that you're not immune to the shortcomings of this industry. You've all felt the shortcomings of this industry too, yourselves. In your own families, in your friends, in your neighbors, in your coworkers. People have been let down by what this industry should be able to offer. That's the reality of it, right? And so I'm going to ask you to not compartmentalize for the remainder of this talk and try to integrate that part of you. Don't keep that on the sideline. Keep that front and center, because that's the part that's going to allow you to really embrace the idea that something new can happen. All right, so from that place, we're integrated. We're not compartmentalized anymore. We're integrated. From that place, let's play a game. We're going to play the Wheel of Disruption. All right. Come on, everybody. Who knows what's going to be the thing that's going to bankrupt this damn industry? What's it going to be? What's it going to be? I'll start. Bezos is coming. I like when the laughs build a little bit. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, I was kind of scared, but that's kind of funny. No, seriously, Amazon. Amazon has been making investments in healthcare for far longer than I think most of us have been tracking. They've hit headlines over the last 12 months for sure, but they've been making these investments for 5 or more years. And this has always been an ambition of Amazon's, not just to take over healthcare, to take over everything. Right? That's what the A to Z arrow means. So we should respect their capabilities and respect their ambitions, right? So let's just put Amazon on the list of potential disruptors on the wheel of disruption. What else? Let's talk about Walmart. How many people have heard Walmart talk about appropriateness of care? You should have been at my event last year. All right. So last August, I spent 20 minutes on stage with Marcus Osborne. He's the Vice President of Health and Wellness Transformation at Walmart. And he basically sat in front of a room of health system executives and employees and told them that he does not care about health systems at all. And that all he cares about is that his cost of care is too damn big, and he thinks he can cut it down by a third or maybe even half by only paying for appropriate care. So what does that look like? It looks like direct deals, it looks like closed networks, it looks like him managing all the claims data, it looks like him totally taking control over this entire enterprise. And that's no big deal, they're just the biggest employer in America, right? What about the silver tsunami? Now look, my parents are old. I just went through that, right? And I watched them. You know, they think they should be able to consume as much healthcare as they can. Don't care who's paying for it. Just use it. I mean, we got to figure this out, right? And what about the millennials? So they are now the largest workforce generation. They're winning elections now. For a while, everyone thought they weren't voting. Now they're running and they're winning. And they expect everything in their life to be on their phone, on demand, delivered to their door. Now, I've worked in technology and healthcare, but I've also worked in technology in other industries. And I can just tell you from my experience that healthcare is just a little bit behind. I loved yesterday's talk because I learned something new. I was going to come out here and talk about physician burnout, but now I can talk about moral injury, which feels so much more appropriate. Moral injury to physicians, moral injury to nurses. We really don't have a great idea on how to handle this yet. We're all looking at it. We know it's an issue. We're thinking about how to grow the numbers at the top of the funnel, but how do we stop the bleed? We really don't know what to do here yet. I think we learned a lot yesterday about how we can start to move in that direction. President Trump, CMS, HHS. This is only going to get more serious. It's only going to get more serious. Reimbursements are going to continue to come down. You all know that. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But interoperability, pretty interesting new rules that are in place around that and the stiff penalties over the next 24, 38 months that are going to go down for data blockers, particularly the EMRs. And transparency law. The executive order that was just signed yesterday, backed by all the different legislation that's been passed in healthcare over the last decade, and now he's about to hand it to CMS and HHS to figure out how to actually implement that. So this is only going to get more and more aggressive, we believe. And he's even charged them with coming up with an entire model on how to introduce real choice and competition. Now, this is almost like you're writing a fairy tale. I don't know if you've read this report that CMS and HHS collaborated on, along with the Department of Labor. But it basically looks like a brave new world for healthcare. Like a totally brave new world, and removing all of the barriers that would stop an external entrant from coming into the industry and really being able to compete for the very, very same dollars. And so just to know that this kind of stuff is even being drafted, even being written, even being thought about, even being discussed in Capitol Hill and amongst these different agencies and departments is a really, really big deal. And why is the government pushing this? Well, it's because the biggest problem that we're really facing is negative public sentiment. People are just not liking the healthcare industry these days. They just lump us all together, right? They don't know the difference between providers and payers and pharma and staffing, and they don't know the difference. They just know healthcare, right? And we have really bad numbers that make for really bad headlines, right? So what are those numbers? Premiums. These are bad numbers. These are just bad numbers. Household spending, the only category in the US Census that goes up double digits when everything else goes down, that's a bad number, right? The public's supposed to point that out and say, that's not good. Fraud, bad numbers, going up, right? What's with the fraud? That's bad. Opioids, bad. Bad headlines, bad. Overpriced drugs that people need to live that are going up in cost when they've been around forever. Bad. It's bad. If we actually had the rise of the consumer in healthcare, if we actually had it, that would help us. Because an educated consumer is a good consumer, right? One who understands how the industry actually works, and so they can know, this is the provider over here, this is the payer, this is pharma, and they can kind of understand how it's all working. Today, that's not possible. Today, everything is happening behind a very cryptic policy and copay model, and they don't understand anything that's happening, and so all they can do is, from an uneducated perspective, read headlines and be angry, and that's only going to create a flywheel of more and more aggressive activity coming from the government. So, that's a short list of things that could make up the wheel of disruption, but what's really going to do it? What's really going to create disruption? It's going to be the convergence and the complexity of all these things. Not any one thing, but the convergence and the complexity of all of them. That's where the real danger and the real threat to this industry is. Now, having gone through all that, I just want to be really clear. I live in a city where the largest industry is healthcare. I am not pro-disruption healthcare, okay? I am pro-disruption in a lot of stuff. As a consumer, I love disruption. But in healthcare in particular, because I now understand how important this industry is, I'm not pro-disruption. And here are some of my reasons why. First of all, it's approaching 20% of the GDP, right? I don't want something that is that big a part of the GDP getting swiftly disrupted. That sounds like chaos to me, right? A large, high-performing bucket of stocks on the stock market are in the healthcare category. Now we're talking about people's retirements. We're talking about mutual funds. We're talking about things that invest against the S&P index. I don't want that disrupted. That's not good for the middle class. Employment. After Walmart, as an individual employer, collectively, healthcare is the largest employer in the country, right? It's the #1 industry right now, employing people in the country. We all care about jobs. We all look at the economic report that comes out every quarter, and the #1 metric we're looking at is jobs. I don't want to see less jobs, right? So I don't want this industry to be disrupted. But people want it to be disrupted. The headlines are bad. And that's something that we collectively have got to come to terms with. We've got to accept the fact that there are people out there that want this industry to be disrupted, okay? That's the real scary thing. We got to come to terms with that, but we can do something about it if we remember your story, okay? So I'm going to tell a version of this story, and apologies for anyone who thinks I'm being too Nashville-centric. It just happens to be the city that I live in and the story that I know the best. I have traveled to other cities, and I am getting to know other healthcare stories from around the country, but I know the Nashville one pretty well, so I'll just tell that one because I think it exemplifies the point I'm trying to make here. In 1968, Jack Massey, Thomas Frist Sr., and Thomas Frist Jr. launch Hospital Corporation of America, now called HCA Healthcare. They do it on the back of healthcare reform by LBJ that happened in the mid-1960s, now known basically as Medicare, but really an extension of the Social Security Act. The beginning of the government really getting serious about paying for healthcare. And they realized that if they put financial and operational rigor behind healthcare, they can make it into a scalable business. They do this, these three people, they're not like super powerful moguls. This is a startup, okay? Let's get really, really clear. This is a startup. This is their office. This looks worse than the house that I started in with Emma Email Marketing. This is not a big company. It's entrepreneurial. It's scrappy. They go public the next year. Have you ever heard of a startup being able to go public in a year? No. That's because back then, in the 60s, going public was like getting a venture round. There was no regulations in place, right? None. There was no Sarbanes-Oxley, there was no Frank Dodd, there was none of that stuff. It was just, hey, I got a company, I got some shares. Okay, cool, here's some money. That's what it was like back then, right? So they get some money, they have this idea, and they start to grow, and then they grow, and they grow, and they grow really, really quickly, right? They grow so quickly that they can't capture all the opportunity that the healthcare industry has, now that the government's deciding to pay for it, with the people locked inside of the building, right? It's all sitting inside of HCA, all the talent, all the capital, and there's all this opportunity out there, but it starts to get slow. You can't process all the opportunity inside of one company, inside of one building. You can't do it. And then in 1981, DRGs happen. And that was the catalyst for change to happen. It introduced a market environment in which it no longer made perfect sense to operate everything outside of a single business, everything outside of a single building. Now, let's start creating specialty businesses to tackle each one of those different DRGs because it's no longer cost plus, we're paying per service line. And so what happens? The launch of Massey Birch Capital Corporation. Lucius Birch and Jack Massey, one of HCA's co-founders, launch a venture capital fund, an innovative venture capital fund in the 80s to take advantage of this opportunity in the market. They've got the capital, they've got all the talent inside of HCA, right? And they start launching companies. When they do this, a bunch of other big money folks from the coast and middle America start seeing this, moving to town and start launching other venture capital funds as well. The big private equity funds start coming to town as well. And over the course of 20, 25 years, you now have what's called the Nashville healthcare family tree. 600 plus companies that have been built to become by far the #1 industry in the city. 1 in every 4 jobs in my city is a healthcare job. That was 50 years ago. This all happened in 50 years. Took over the city, right? And while they were doing all that, by the way, acute care dramatically improves in the United States. Life expectancy goes up 10 years. It is starting to dip now, something you need to pay attention to, right? But over this time of innovation, of entrepreneurship, we're also improving clinically at the same time. So both these things can happen at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. I know that all the other cities out there across the country that have developed healthcare clusters have very similar stories. I know that's because healthcare clusters don't drop out of the sky. I understand that you all are working for mature organizations with scale and lots of employees and lots of capital and big balance sheets. I get it. But they didn't start that way, okay? They didn't start that way. They started with entrepreneurs. They started managing risk. They started putting capital on the line. They started understanding opportunities and going after those opportunities. Somewhere in here, that DNA still exists. Somewhere, it still exists. And I'm asking you to go back and get that DNA because it's your legacy. And the time is now. This is not the last 50 years. This is the beginning of the next 50 years. That's where we are. And what you did over the last 50 years is not going to get you where you need to go for the next 50 years. You're going to have to go back to that entrepreneurial DNA, and you're going to have to figure out a new way to capture opportunity and manage risk. So reclaim that legacy. It's yours. It's your story. When Mike came out here and talked about the OSF founding, that's what's important. What is the founding of your organizations? Don't tell me about what's going on quarter to quarter. Go back to how it started. The genesis, the reason it's even here at all today, right? That's what you got to do. Okay, so for those of you who were rolling eyes back then, you may now be saying, that's great, that was 50 years ago, and now we're much different. We're mature, we have a lot more on the line, and I get that, and I agree. You're right. You're not the same as you were then. I get that, right? You're wiser. You're better. You can be a better innovator today than you were at the dawn of this industry. It all starts with self-awareness. So, we have to be honest. If we don't think that there's an issue, we're never going to change anything. How many of you think we have an issue? All right, then we can start to change some things. We have to know that there is an issue, and we got to be willing to work on ourselves. I believe, because I kind of know you all, I hang out with you a lot, right? I believe the issue is confirmation bias. I think even as great as this is, we just spend too much time hanging out together and listening to each other and nodding and agreeing. Yeah, I agree with that, right? It's too much. You guys got to get out of the house more. See other things, explore, listen to other perspectives. Share your perspective. That's how we're going to figure out how to move into the next 50 years of what healthcare needs to look like. Now, I'm not saying that we're definitely going to get disrupted. That's not what I'm saying. Even though every other industry in this country either has been or is going to be, I'm not saying that's your truth. But I'm definitely saying that there's a chance that you will be disrupted. I'm definitely saying there's a chance that you will be disrupted. And it's because people want it. There are people out there who every single day are making it their mission to start the real disruption of this industry. And behind them are companies with capital and capabilities and desire to help that happen. And so there's a chance. And while all this is happening, and we're subject to our confirmation bias, we're also really busy keeping the trains on time. So we got work to do, right? We got to keep the trains on time. We got to keep the budgets balanced. We got to keep the risks managed. But are we? Are we keeping the risks managed? Let's just say the chance of disruption is 10%. Let's just say it's 10%. How much are we collectively, and I'm not talking about OSF with their $150 million venture fund, how much are we collectively investing to manage the 10% risk? Less than 1%. Less than 1%, right? That's inadequate. That's not going to manage the risk of disruption. It's not going to get it done, right? The reality is that we're not ready for disruption if it happens. Again, I'm not saying it's going to. I'm saying if it happens, we're not ready. So, back to self-awareness. You're also not Amazon, you're not Apple, you're not Silicon Valley. That's not what you do. What do? You keep the trains on time. You balance the budgets. You keep the risks managed. So what I'm asking you to do in your story today is to leverage your strengths. Be exactly who you are. You don't have to go back 50 years ago and be a crazy, scrappy entrepreneur in a house. That's not real, right? But manage the risk. Manage the risk. So here's the two words that I want to put together that I Googled and I couldn't really find put together this way. And I want to introduce these two words together as a concept that you may use in your story going forward. Disruption insurance. Let's create insurance to manage the risk of disruption. Okay? We're not talking about we have to be totally innovative, even though I've already said you are innovative. I've already made that clear. But I am talking about managing the risk of a threat that is super significant to the future of this country, not to mention your own companies. Disruption insurance. How do we get that? First, narrative. It's the lack of narrative that got us in this place in the first place, right? The lack of narrative. You hear over and over again, your story matters, your story matters. Where is your story? Tell the story, make people feel something. You have to start with the narrative, right? What is the largest grossing movie and franchise of all time? In the front, what do you think it is? Okay, I heard Avatar. That's close. That's really cool because they did a lot of CG tricks. But the answer is Avengers in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's number one, okay? Why is this number one? Narrative. Narrative. Over the course of 10 years, 28 movies with a spectrum of heroes that speak to different demographics, with the highest stakes imaginable, the end of all human life. They got everybody on Earth to care about Avengers Endgame, right? They got everybody to care about it. Healthcare has the heroes. It's got the villains. It's got the high stakes. It's got the challenges. It's got the journey. It's got everything in it. You just need to wrap it up in a narrative, right? There's nothing that they're doing that you can't do with where we sit right now with healthcare in this country. So build a narrative. It is the most important thing you can do. You can't really make progress in innovation without it. Second, process. Okay, biggest misunderstanding in the world about innovation is that somehow innovation is just for crazy, risk-tolerant people. That's actually not correct. Innovation, when effective, is supposed to be managed in a process. It's supposed to be de-risked. Now, I'm not saying every single experiment you do in innovation is going to be successful, but the management of time, resources, that has to be managed in a process, right, in order for it to be successful. Eric Schmidt, the former CEO and chairman of Google, said innovation is managed chaos, right? And Google is clearly one of the most innovative companies in the world. His whole premise was that we have to wrap innovation, because it's so risky, in a very, very rigorous process. And who is better at process than the healthcare industry? I mean, nobody. You guys are the best, right? So you ought to be able to innovate better than anybody else. And then finally, resources. And this is probably my biggest punchline for you all. So there's a joke in the healthcare venture capital space, which is anytime a founder of one of our portfolio companies comes up to us and goes, "Marcus, I'm so excited. I got a meeting with the head of innovation at blah, blah, blah hospital." We know that that's where innovation goes to die. Right? You cannot resource innovation with half a person. And the head of innovation is usually half a person. I've talked to enough of them, right? You can't even manage innovation by yourself. You can't. You have to do it in a collaborative way. You have to do it with others, right? It is going to take capital. It's going to take time, and not just anyone's time, leadership's time. Leadership's time, right? And it's going to take partnerships. You cannot do this by yourself. Forget about it. You're going to have to find out how to open kimono and partner for the greater good. And you're already doing that. There's already so many mergers that have been happening out there, but everything doesn't need to be a merger, y'all. Everything doesn't need to be acquired in order for you to be able to move forward with it. You can find ways to share risk, share incentives, and share the rewards, right? You can find ways to do that. Now, this recipe does exist in small pockets. I've given them several shout outs. I'll just say it one more time. OSF basically does this today, right? So this does exist. There are places you can go right now in this country and around the world as healthcare is becoming more global, and you can find instances where organizations have employed disruption insurance and they're ready. They're ready for the risk if it comes. And in the meantime, they're moving the business forward, which is awesome, right? But it is a narrative. And oh, by the way, it's a finance narrative. It's a finance narrative because it's a risk management narrative, right? People always try to separate innovation from the finance people. It's crazy. You can't do innovation without the finance people, right? So this is a finance narrative for innovation. An innovation supply chain. Just imagine that concept, an innovation supply chain. Predictably, every year, you're integrating 3 to 5 to 7 to 10 new important innovations that move your balance sheet and income statement in predictable ways. You can get there. You can get there. So one of the biggest arguments I hear to all this stuff, not even the innovation stuff, really the disruption stuff, is healthcare is different, Marcus. Oh, you've heard that too? Healthcare is different, Marcus. Healthcare is different. Having been around it as long as I have, I get it. Healthcare is different. I get it. It's totally different. But it's not immune, right? You're not immune from disruption. You're not. You are different, but you're not immune. So please don't be blissfully ignorant. There's way too much at stake right now for us to act like different means safe. It doesn't mean safe. And on the topic of immunity, I also think that this has been probably the biggest disappointment for me when we compartmentalize and we operate from our positions and from our organizations. We want to have the pride of operating in a super ethical industry. We feel so good about it because we touch lives, but yet we're not willing to address hard ethical questions. All too often, we're not willing to address these hard ethical questions. With the GDP being where it is right now, how can we afford to not drop the cost of care? It's completely immoral to pass the buck on to the next generation. We have to do this. There's a moral imperative behind this for us. People are going bankrupt. This is not stock photo, y'all. This is Barbara Radley. She's got diabetes, she's got liver failure, and filing bankruptcy didn't help her because the bills keep coming in. This is real life. People who have dedicated too many years of their life to the profession of medicine are ready to jump out of it. This is not stock photo. This is really Amy Baxter, an incredible pain management doctor who is really happy that she left the profession and says all her friends who are her peers are really jealous of her because she's no longer dealing with the stress. How can it be that in this country there are people who can't get care within a 30 to 45-minute drive? And this is happening more and more every single day as rural hospitals close. We're smart enough and well enough equipped to solve these problems. There's simply too much at stake to not try. We can lower the cost of care if we innovate. We can stop physician moral injury if we innovate. We can stop families going bankrupt if we innovate. We can turn the public's perspective around on this industry if we innovate. And there's also a lot of fortune in it for us. If we manage to pull this off, we're all going to do really, really well. Reminder, it's 20% of the GDP. There's a reason why Amazon's going after it. So just know, this is possible. It is possible for us to become innovative. It's possible. And things move faster than you think. We don't have that much time. 13 years ago, none of you had ever swiped or pinched on a phone. And now it's all you do. Things move faster than you think. So I want you to know that I am almost entirely certain that you all are going to figure this out. It has been my incredible honor to spend some time with you today talking to you about the moral imperative that we all have in front of us. I hope you've been able to accept it, and I hope that you will take this opportunity to go back to your organizations and start the important work on your narrative. Because here's the deal. The risk is not in innovation. The risk is in failing to innovate. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus.